So I'm going to talk about some applied stuff, and actually it was titled in the program like Kremlin's style of negotiations. However, I would change it slightly, talking about Kremlin matrix of negotiations, because it's not just about the style, it is about mindset, perception of the other side, strategies, tricks, and all the other. Let me begin with quite funny story, getting back to the February 2022. 21st of February. So when the war started, Russians were quick enough to offer to Ukrainians to launch negotiations on the third day of war. So Ukrainians were quite happy with this, because before that Russians played the strategy of avoidance of any kind of communication with Ukrainian side. So what happened at this first tour of negotiations afterwards? 3 members of Ukrainian delegation were allegedly poisoned by some unidentified staff, because they had some respiratory problems and also some eye irritation. And one guy from Ukrainian delegation was killed at some unidentified circumstances. So it was quite a strange way of inviting Ukraine to negotiations. And what was the message? So I was asked about this, and there were 2 interpretations. First, to show to Ukrainians what the Russians are going to do with Ukraine if Ukraine is not going to be negotiable. And the second is just to actually discourage Ukrainians to come for next tour of negotiations, because who would die, shake hands with Russians afterwards? So basically what happened next, we had also some secret back channel of negotiations, implying some of Russian oligarchs. Probably you've heard of Mr. Abramovich in this. And allegedly, he came first to see Mr. Putin after he met Zelensky with some written note from our president. And when Mr. Putin read this note, Abramovich asked him, "What should I send back to Ukrainian president?" And the Russian president replied, "Tell him that I will destroy them." So that means that we need to decipher or to decode the Russian style of negotiations, just to understand what they really imply by that. And here, Ukrainians probably are much better placed than any other country, because having this common history and sharing some common folklore, we can actually understand what Russian means when they use this or that proverb, or we can understand what children games they play. For instance, there is a very common game which is called городки, or small towns, small cities, which means that you construct a small town out of small bricks, and then your goal is to smash it with some hard stick, and the winner is those who've smashed most of these townies, of these small городки. So that means that Russians take destruction as entertainment. And you won't know this unless you know all this folklore and you don't know this history. Or for instance, if we're talking about such a method as bluff, Russians have a proverb, it's not important who you are, it is important who you show to others. So that means that they're not very much interested in the substance as such, but in the perception of what they want to deliver to the others. So basically, when we're talking about the existing models of approaching Russians in negotiations these days, from Western partners, we can distinguish 2 approaches. First is to accommodate to Russia, which basically France and Germany are trying to perform with some help of Italy. And second is to put it straightforwardly, like take it or leave it, what Americans and our UK partners are doing. Ukrainians at the moment applying a sort of improvisation without substance. This was the approach they used in the first part of negotiations, which actually proved to be quite helpful. However, they were not experienced negotiators. They were improvising, but actually they applied the tactics that Russians were using always, like sending mixed messages, withdrawing the previous commitments, having this different level of authorities of decision makers. This actually frustrated Russians a lot. They didn't know what to expect from Ukrainian side. But it's not funny enough, because sooner or later we still end with negotiations. And the problem for us is that we need to be prepared for these negotiations with Russia and be prepared to play their game in order to overplay them. So therefore, I will give you a bit of hint what Russian metrics of negotiation means, with some of element of it, and why it is important to talk about Russian culture and all this kind of stuff. Just because these negotiations are going to be quite emotional and stressful. The studies shows that negotiator is 50% made of individual agenda, individual upbringing, and 50% of cultural stuff. But when it comes to the stressful negotiations, all of the negotiators tend to perform cultural biases. So therefore, it's very important for you to know what Russians' cultural biases are. So, the basic line is that, and it's always mistaken by our Western partners, who actually made decisions based on theory of rational choice, which means that if you see it's rational, you offer this to your partner in negotiations, he is ready to accept this because this is beneficial for you. Russian mindset is completely different. I studied psychology negotiations in St. Petersburg, and we do share with them a bit of this irrational thinking. So most of the decisions which Russians are made based not on rational considerations, but rather on some sort of intangibles, something that you can value out of emotional triggers, like respect, authority, status, whatever. So it's very important to understand that only these factors play very well in Russian mindset when you deal with them. So basically, second important stuff is perception of opponent. Russians, unlike the Harvard negotiation model, when you see win-win situation and you treat your opponent as potential partner, Russians tend to resort to competitive model, which is win and lose. And it's not just about me winning the bigger parts. It is about how much do you lose. I'm very much interested in how much do you lose. So this is something that Russians apply as well. And you need to understand this. So Russians actually enter in negotiations treating opponent as a foe, not as a partner. And the strategies that they're using, out of 5 or 7 basic strategies defined in conflict management by Thomas Kilman, they rather accommodate either to competitive model, I win, you lose, avoidance model, I'm withdrawing myself from negotiations for you not to be able to take a decision. This is something that we observed when Russians declined to talk to Ukrainians. Therefore, Normandy format stalled at some point in the past. Or the most popular model, actually, which they are playing right now, is revenge with self-damage. It means that Russians would be ready to suffer a bit if they see that the opponent suffers more. So they're ready to sustain your sanctions, they're ready to sustain business isolation, all the other discomfort, isolation, but because they see that Ukraine suffers more, they're ready to go ahead. So, what are the main tools of and instruments they apply? Most commonly used, it's time pressure. So they either put you into very lengthy negotiations, so you're getting tired. Russians normally played with 2 teams on that. So they're having one for first 10 hours, then they have another one, fresh one, for another 8 hours. This is something actually what we observed with Minsk Accords. They spent more than 11 hours of negotiations on the level of leaders of states. Another element is they create extra need or over motivation for your opponent to get to negotiated agreement. This is something which they applied again with Minsk Accords, when we had Ilovaisk, when we had Donetsk airport. So a lot of heavy shelling. If you can just follow what Russians are doing right now, every time we enter negotiations, we don't have interim ceasefire. We just have massive shelling of Russians, thus inducing Ukrainians to be very sensitive and be rushing into unfavorable decisions. Then they also use bluff, I've already mentioned it, brinkmanship. This is very important stuff. So they tend to speculate on a luck. So they're not making a sort of thoroughly calculated decisions, but they're just putting high anchoring. So it means that their demands sometimes looks quite absurd, like we saw this with ultimatum to NATO. But this is something that they gamble on. So either it will go or it will not go. Also very interesting trait, personal offense or depreciation. I can recall one very interesting negotiation with Russians on MH17. The lady who was in charge of Ukrainian delegation, we're talking about some concerns, which we normally know as concerns. But in Russian, the word concerns could have dual meaning. The second is sexual preoccupation. So basically, Russians replied to her, we don't know what your concerns are, but basically saying, we don't know, you probably preoccupied with some sexual stuff. So, and she actually got, she was set aback because she didn't know how to reply to it. Then they have also principal agent problem. So they tend to send the lower level of delegation in order to speculate that they need some high authority just to judge the final decision. Therefore, they're just creating this time lag for them not to be responsible for what they're saying. So most of their negotiators are acting as the transmitters of messages to the higher authority. And changing commitments. This is very interesting stuff. They can withdraw what they said previously, and one of the most notorious cases here is negotiations over Black Sea fleet in back in the 90s, when the member of Ukrainian delegation just incidentally spotted that Russians just changed the page at already initialed document. They just put a different page in it. And it was because of sharp eye of Ukrainian negotiator that we actually didn't get into this trap. So what I've said right now drives us to the question whether it's a waste of time of negotiation with Russians. My answer would be no, it's not the waste of time, because eventually we had to sit with them. But the problem is the momentum of ripeness of negotiations. It hasn't happened so far. It hasn't happened yet, because Russians are still thinking that they can achieve their goals unilaterally by heavy shelling, by more destructions, by frightening Ukrainians. Therefore, they actually pretend to negotiate. They imitate negotiations at this stage. Ukrainian side also counts on some different factors, understanding that it's not the time, not the momentum for negotiation. Therefore, my appeal to you is, please don't press us to negotiate with Russia at this moment. The moment hasn't come yet. And I am very much grateful to the position of UK, to the position of US, the Baltic countries, because they do understand that there is no momentum created at this moment. And if you have this authority and influence over your European partners like France, Italy, and Germany, please convey my message to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Having heard what you told us, will the right moment ever come for negotiating with the Russians?
Yes, definitely it will come. And right now, time factor plays into Ukrainian hands, but this is not everlasting exercise. So my assessment is 3-4 months, and we need to generate this game changer. And for Ukrainian side, game changer right now is getting sufficient amount of military assistance from our Western partners in order of us to be able to do a scale counter-offensive attack and then force Russia to negotiate on our terms.
That will take 3-4 months.
Well, it requires a very sophisticated strategy, not just on the Ukrainian side, but also on our Western partners. So far, we are doing the right steps. We are negotiating with our Western partners first, not talking to Russians. Actually, they feel themselves being extremely offended by this, but actually we need to keep momentum, because otherwise Russians are just trying to exploit the strategy of attrition, not just on the battlefield, but also in political and diplomatic realm. So they count on this food crisis, intolerance to energy crisis. They want to extend the war till winter time, and this will make all of us fragile.
But how will you negotiate then to avoid the Russians playing all their dirty tricks to you?
we can play it back.
You didn't tell me of any Ukrainian dirty tricks.
No, actually, I didn't tell a lot of this Kremlin school of negotiation as a methodology, but for those who are interested, I'm happy to talk on coffee breaks.
Thank you.
Thank you.